Good morning, world. I am Judy, your web-based therapist, making therapy accessible and convenient for our clients in Florida and New York, and of course, sharing information worldwide. Today, I want to talk about primary elections because over the last few weeks, I've talked a little bit about primary elections and I've mentioned about voting. And I've mentioned how important it is to vote and all how voting is how we're going to get the changes that we're asking for. But I want to talk about primary elections because I have discovered that it is something that many people don't know about and that some people don't even realize is a thing. So today we're talking about primary elections, and that's why the first thing we're talking about is what is a primary election? A primary election is, I often describe it as the runoff or the playoffs of the elections. Most people are familiar with the fact that we have that two-party system where when you go vote in November, there's a Democrat and there's a Republican, and there are some other lesser known parties that are represented on your ballot. But they don't know how you get to that one Democrat or how you get to that one Republican. The primary is how you do that. Whenever there's an election, and we've seen that with the presidential elections, a lot of people throw in their name and want to be the representative for their party. For instance, and we just had the presidential Democratic primary where there were I think they started with nearly 20 people who were contenders, and then they've narrowed it down to one person. And for all the offices, from your governors to your state representatives, your senators, your Congress people, same thing happens is when the office becomes open or when the office is up for election, several people put their names in, and then at the primary, that's where people decide, hey, this is who's going to represent our party in November. So the primary, technically the playoff, a lot of other stuff happened, but the main part that happens is where the Democrats get to pick their Democrat and the Republicans get to pick their Republican. That's the biggest piece of the primary. 2. When are primaries? Primary elections are usually set by your state division of elections, and they use the information they use is based on your state constitution and your state legislature. That's how they determine what date it's in. And different states have it at different time. For instance, in Florida, our primaries are coming up in August, but in the state of Massachusetts, their primaries are coming up in September. It all depends on the state and the state legislature in the state or the state division of elections. But you can find that information usually by going on the Division of Elections website or your Supervisor of Elections website. And the way you find those websites, just do a general search. Your county or your state and your state division of elections. For instance, if I do Florida and I put in Division of Elections, the Florida Division of Elections is going to be one of the websites. And if I do Palm Beach County and I put in Supervisor of Elections, the Palm Beach County Supervisor of Elections will show up. And sometimes even if you put the state, not the state, but the city or something like in Supervisor of Elections, the Supervisor of Elections for that region will very likely come up. So, and on their website is when you're going to find when the primaries are. Primaries are usually a few months before the November election. And again, November elections, we know they generally happen every 2 years, and the even years that are divisible by 4 are usually your presidential elections. That's your 12, 16, 20, 24, 28. That's usually your presidential elections. And of course, the even years that are not divisible by 4 are usually your governor's election. But in both elections, you're also electing a lot of the other offices, such as senators, representatives, congresspeople, supervisors of elections, judges, state attorneys. So there are a lot of other offices that are being elected at the same time, but those are usually the top of the ticket is usually either your president or your governor. And there's going to be a primary before that election. 3, can everyone vote? Not yes and no, depending on your state. A state like Florida has a closed primary system, meaning that if you're a registered Republican, you can vote in only the Republican primary. So if there's not a Republican primary for an office, you don't get to vote in that. but usually your ballot will have whatever elections have a Republican primary that will be included in your ballot. If you're a Democrat, same thing. You can only vote in the Democratic primary. So if there are Democratic primaries happening, they will show up on your ballot, but they will not show up. But that's all you get to vote for. If you are nonpartisan in the state of Florida, you get to sit out until November after the Democrats and the Republicans have picked their representative, and you get to pick between one of those two. Some states, like Massachusetts, for example, has a semi-closed primary, where if you're a registered Democrat, you must vote in the Democratic primary. If you're a registered Republican, you can only vote in the Republican primary. But if you are not registered with a party, you get to pick which one you vote in. You don't get to vote in both, but you get to pick which of the two that you're going to vote in for that. So, but in some states, it's a lot more open. It's decided by the state, and you find this information again through your supervisor of elections for your county or the state division of elections. But the one way to ensure that you're always voting, and it makes if your state has a closed primary system, make sure that you affiliate with a party in order to be able to participate. Why is the primary important to us? A lot of times the decision is already made by the time you get to November, because it's who you pick for November that determines what happens. Who you pick in the primary determines what happens when you go in November. So if you don't make sure that you get the right candidate in the primary, then you may have a candidate that can't deliver in November. The other part of it is we're focusing on getting people who are going to be representing what we need, who are going to be pushing and speaking up for our agenda. In the primary is where you get to decide, hey, I think this person is more likely to represent us. So if you're not voting in the primary in November, you just get to show up and pick from the 2 people or the 3 people on the ballot that other people chose. And those people may not necessarily represent or be interested in representing our agenda. They may not necessarily be interested in representing what we need. So voting in the primary is how we get to pick the person who is going to really represent us. And the other part of it is that sometimes elections get decided in the primary. There are places where elections don't go into November. Things like judges, for instance, a lot of those judge elections end in the primary. So if we're not participating in the primary, we're missing the opportunity to have a say in that. Which brings me to the next one, which is the primary a real election? Absolutely. It's a very real election. Many times elections get decided. Judges, a lot of time the judicial races are decided in the primary and only go into the November election if, for example, they need to do a runoff. That's when they end up in the November. Otherwise, it's done at the primary. There are places where it may be that the district is so skewed one way that the other party, for instance, I know District 7 in Palm Beach County is 60-40 Democratic. So a lot of times, Republicans don't even waste their time running in that seat, because at 60-40, they are pretty much, they have a pretty good idea how that one's going to go. So they invest their resources in other areas. There are other places where it may be 60-40 Republican. So in those areas, the Democrats are most likely not going to waste their resources running in a 60-40 area, because they pretty much have an idea what is going to happen. So if you're not participating in the primary there, to make sure that you have an opportunity to speak or to voice your opinion or pick your person in that primary, you may not get a chance to do so in November. And again, a lot of the time, the judges are picked during the primary, and judges, we know we've been talking about the whole issue with the justice system and how some judges are not doing right by our community, and how the justice system has been a little bit somewhat tilted against us. So in order to make sure that we're getting judges that are going to be fair, judges that are going to be just, we need to make sure that we're participating in the primaries so that we're getting to pick judges. Okay, so let's do a quick recap. 1, what is the primary? It's technically the runoff or the knockout round of the elections. That's where the Democrats pick their Democrat and the Republican pick their Republican, and they go head to head in November. 2, when are primaries? It's determined by your state. Each state has their primary at a different time. And look on your state division of election or your local supervisor of elections websites. You'll be able to find those dates. But generally, every 2 years before a governor's race or before a presidential race, there's going to be a primary. 3, can everyone vote? Sort of, depending on where you live. Some states have closed primaries. In closed primaries, you have to be party affiliated. In some states where independents and nonpartisan or no party affiliations get to vote, but you need to figure out what the rule is in your state. 4, why is the primary important? Because that's where we get to pick who's going in November. That's where we get to make sure that we pick someone that's going to represent us. If you don't take the time to get the right person in the primary, by the time you get to November, it may be too late when people talk about picking the lesser of two evils. If you don't take the time to make a choice, you may end up having to pick the one that's less bad in November. And finally, is the primary a real election? Absolutely. Sometimes some offices get elected in the primary, and sometimes the primary is the only opportunity you get to pick the right person to represent our agenda. So we have to make sure that we're showing up for the primaries. As always, if you or someone you know happens to be going through something that's more than you can handle, please remember that even right now, when many things are still so chaotic, there are professionals like myself who are available, able, and willing to assist and are even providing remote services. So please figure out who those people are in your community so that if you need the help, you can reach out and get the help that you need. And that is all we have for today. Good morning, world. Have an awesome day.